To begin with, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to return again to the center here at Samiling and to meet with the group of people who have come here together for these teachings. First and foremost among them, of course, the Venerable Akhong Rinpoche. I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to come together and discuss the concepts of Dharma over the next few days. During this particular kalpa, or age in which we live, from the time that this kalpa began until the time in the far distant future that it will end, there will be a total of 1,000 Buddhas, fully enlightened beings, that will appear among us. 4 of these have already appeared. The first 3 of them, known in the Tibetan tradition as Korwajik, Sertup, and Usung, have already appeared, presented their teachings, and their teachings have endured for some time in this world and then passed away, disappeared. The 4th Buddha, Shakyamuni, of course, appeared several thousand years ago among human beings, and the teachings which this 4th Buddha in this series of 1,000 delivered, presented to people, are still accessible to us. We are still in the period of time then, in the aftermath of the advent of this 4th Buddha. In the case of all of these fully enlightened Buddhas, the kinds of teachings which they present are more or less the same. That is to say, each and every Buddha will present teachings upon the levels that we know as the Shravakayana, the Pratyekabuddhayana, and the Bodhisattvayana, the ordinary teachings of the Hinayana and Mahayana vehicles. All of these 1,000 Buddhas, all Buddhas that ever will appear, ever have appeared, all of them teach in the same way in presenting these teachings. The particular distinction between many other Buddhas and Shakyamuni was that due to the Buddha Shakyamuni's aspirations and resolve, due to the particular circumstances into which he manifested, he was able to present the teachings we know as the Vajrayana, the Tantras, on a fairly public, widespread level, which is not the case with other Buddhas. It is not always the case, it is very rarely the case, in fact, that a Buddha can present the teachings of the Vajrayana so explicitly.
말아서 찌따를 통화를 그때 쓰는 말을 쳐봐야 말이지. 내나요 저스 라이트 떡지 그냥 뭐 라도 타서 내가 타서도 오늘 then 해봤던 말을 말이지.
It is not that there is any essential difference in the kinds of beings being taught. In fact, this is the one universal, that each and every sentient being, each and every unenlightened being that is a possible candidate, we might say, for enlightenment, that may receive a Buddha's teachings, each and every being has what we call Tathagata Garbha, has the Buddha nature, the fundamental nature of their minds as the potential for enlightenment. However, on a practical level, there are many different degrees of individuals. Because of the power of the karma limiting that individual's mind, certain people, certain individuals may be less sensitive or less acute in a spiritual sense than others. And so, because of this gradation of capabilities, aspirations, inclinations, and so forth, a successive graded path of teachings, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and so forth, must be presented. If one asks, well, is there a significant difference between the Hinayana and the Mahayana teachings? Of course there is. This is something which the Buddha attested to in one of his discourses. In one of the sutras one can find the Buddha saying, if the Mahayana is like the sun and the moon, the Hinayana is like a spark from fire. If the Mahayana is like Mount Sumeru, like the central mountain of the universe, then the Hinayana is like an anthill. And if the Mahayana is like a vast ocean, then the Hinayana is like a small puddle in a footprint. So on a practical level, yes, there is a significant difference between the scope of these teachings. One may say, well, why in that case does one not simply extol the Mahayana to the exclusion of everything else and forget about even acknowledging other levels of teaching such as the Hinayana? Well, the point is that would be to throw out something valuable without taking into account its very practical utility. If we have a child and we try to clothe that child in the clothes of an adult, they're obviously not going to fit. They're simply not suitable for that child at that stage of its development. On the other hand, if we take the clothes of the child and try to clothe an adult in them, again, it's not going to work. Each stage of life has its own particular needs, its own particular requirements, which are suited to that stage of life. And the same could be said as regards spiritual development. There are teachings which are appropriate, which are necessary at certain stages, which are not at others. Another thing we must take into account is that people have different interests. They have different ways of looking at things. For example, in the West, an example which is easiest for us to grasp is to take the example of a large restaurant. Now, on a theoretical level, you only need to serve one kind of food, because all anybody is ever going there for is to eat something they enjoy in order to fill their stomach. It serves the same function regardless of what they eat. But if you open a restaurant with one kind of food, you won't get many customers. The reason why it is necessary to offer a variety of dishes is because people have a variety of interests. And even within a single family, we don't find that the parents and the children and so forth all eat exactly the same food. Everybody has their own preferences. Everybody has their own inclinations and interests, even in this very prosaic matter of taking nourishment. And the same can be said for spiritual teaching. People have different inclinations, different kinds of interests and motivation which involve them in spiritual practice, and they require teachings which will accommodate that variety of motivation. The rule of thumb distinction between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist, someone who does follow these teachings of the Buddha Dharma and someone who does not, is the vow of refuge, the concept of taking refuge in the three jewels. On the most fundamental level, a Buddhist is someone who seeks refuge from these three jewels of Buddha Dharma and Sangha. Someone who does not is not, on a practical level, a Buddhist, and this is the fundamental distinction on a formal level of practice that we can make. Even in this fundamental concept of taking refuge, though, as the criteria for distinguishing between someone who does consider themselves a Buddhist and someone who does not, there is what we might term a distinction between the Hinayana and Mahayana attitudes of taking refuge. Now, the formal act may be the same, taking refuge in the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But in the case of a Hinayana mentality, this is the act of taking refuge for one's own benefit, in order to simply liberate oneself personally from the cycle of rebirth, from the cycle of samsara, and to attain enlightenment oneself. The Mahayana context of taking refuge has a much vaster scope. It is either the intention that through one's own personal taking of refuge, through the virtuous nature and through the qualities of that act of one taking refuge oneself in the three jewels, that all beings may eventually come to attain enlightenment. Or on the other hand, it may be the aspiration that in one taking refuge, one speaks for all beings, that oneself and all beings take refuge in the three jewels until enlightenment is reached. And so there is much vaster scope to the Mahayana context of taking the vow of refuge. There is also a difference with regards to the time scale that is involved. In the case of a Hinayana mentality, the person taking refuge from this point of view takes refuge for a temporary period of time, from now until death. For the rest of this life, one takes refuge in the three jewels. And this is in fact incorporated into the ceremony where it says, I, from now until I die, as long as I live, take refuge in the three jewels. In the Mahayana context, one takes refuge until such time as one becomes Buddha oneself, one attains to complete enlightenment, regardless of how many lifetimes that may take. The scope is that one is taking refuge from this moment on until one attains complete enlightenment. On a certain level, one finds that even the objects of refuge, the sources of refuge, in which one takes refuge in the ceremony, that this differs. In the levels of Hinayana and Mahayana, the three vehicles of the Shravakayana, Prajakabudayana, and the Bodhisattvayana, the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are the principal sources of refuge. In the case of tantric practice, however, based upon this act of taking refuge in the three jewels, there is also the act of taking refuge in what are known as the three roots or sources. The gurus, one's personal guru and the lineage gurus, as the source of blessing and spiritual power, the yidams or meditational divinities as the source or root of accomplishment, and the dakinis and dharma protectors as the source of enlightened activity to clear away obstacles on one's path. And so in tantric practice there are in fact these 6 sources of refuge which form an integral part of the ceremony of taking refuge. In tantric practice, one also finds the distinction made between an outer level, an inner level, and a more secret level or hidden level of taking refuge. The outer level is the normal, the ordinary act of taking refuge in the three jewels and the three roots, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the gurus, divinities, and protectors. The inner level is where the Vajra Guru, one's own root guru in Vajrayana practice, becomes for one the embodiment of these sources of refuge, and one takes refuge in the guru as the union of, as a quintessence of all of these sources of refuge. In the case of the three jewels, the guru's physical presence is the expression of the Sangha. The guru's speech and teaching is the expression of the Dharma. And the guru's mind is the expression of Buddhahood, of enlightenment itself. And therefore the guru represents the union of the three jewels. In the case of the three roots, or three sources of Vajrayana refuge, the guru's physical presence is, of course, the guru. The guru's speech is the activity of the dakinis and dharma protectors, and the guru's mind is identical with the divinity, with the meditational divinity or yidam upon which one meditates. And so the inner level of Vajrayana refuge is taking refuge in one's guru, one's personal Vajra guru, as the union of the three jewels and the three roots, these six sources of refuge united in the single presence of the guru. In the case of the secret level of taking refuge, this is taking refuge in one's own mind. This is experiencing the emptiness of one's mind as the Dharmakaya, the clarity and lucidity of one's mind as the Sambhogakaya, and the dynamic unimpeded manifestation of one's mind as the Nirmanakaya. And to be authentically able to take refuge, that is to say to recognize and experience those qualities of mind, is the secret level of Vajrayana refuge. Just as the distinction between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist, someone practicing the Buddha Dharma and someone not involved in this practice, is the concept of refuge, whether the person does take refuge or not. In the same way, the rule of thumb for distinguishing between the Hinayana and Mahayana is the scope of the motivation. A Hinayana mentality is one in which one is practicing whatever one does as one's practice of Dharma for one's own benefit, simply to liberate oneself. The Mahayana mentality, on the other hand, is to practice that for the benefit of all beings, in order to liberate all beings. Now the Hinayana then, referring to the Shravakayana and the Pratyekabuddhayana, on both of these levels the fundamental consideration is the same. It is a personal or egotistical one. One is simply concerned with one's own personal liberation. The distinction between that and the Mahayana attitude is that on the Mahayana level, the liberation of all beings becomes as important as one's own liberation.
사지 단지 이나 쳇밥도 지아리 가르서나 성업도 저거 나도 타이 신지나 하나 손지 임바라 임마스도 다니도 손직다도 샤스 저치 바레스 그렇지 바레스 선지 타지 손지로 이마도 마치 받달라 진짜 합치 시작해야레스 이 롱비 영시도 나도 타이 신지나 하나 손지 임바라 임마스도 다니도 손직다도 샤스
While it might be said that the Mahayana and Vajrayana approach the goal of enlightenment from the same point of view, that is to say that they both while it may be said that both of these levels of practice emphasize the same concern for other beings, they are both based upon this assumption that the practice that one does is not for the benefit simply of oneself personally, but is for the benefit of all beings. While that may be the case, there is a slight difference in the way this is interpreted in the Vajrayana. In the Vajrayana, it is understood that oneself and all beings are Buddha, are already enlightened in a sense, but that there is some lack of recognition of that. And the way in which one develops one's bodhicitta in Vajrayana practice, in the practice of Tantra, is to develop it based upon this understanding, based upon this assumption that oneself and other beings, all beings, are already enlightened, and that the only point is the enlightenment that is already there must be perceived. There is simply a lack of recognition at this point. There is also a distinction to be made on the level of what we might term the philosophical view, the worldview upon which these different levels of practice are based, or rather the worldviews, because there is a significant difference. In the case of the introductory level of the Hinayana, the Shravaka path, there is the realization, ideally, of what is known as the egolessness of the individual, or the non-self of the individual, which is to say that the ego or self is perceived to be illusory, is perceived to be a distortion or fiction and not something ultimately real. There is not, however, the realization of the other aspect of the question, that of the egolessness of phenomena, that this self perceives. There is only a partial, we might say 50% realization at this point, because the only thing that has been realized is the egolessness of the individual and not the egolessness of all phenomena, of the totality of one's experience. Now, on the intermediate level of the Hinayana, the Pratyeka Buddha path, there is, we might say, a 75% realization, because not only is this egolessness of the individual experienced, but also a partial realization of the egolessness of phenomena. That is to say that all the sensory phenomena, all that we are surrounded by and come into contact with in our experience, forms that we see, sounds, tastes, smells, textures, thoughts, all of these are reduced in meditation to, in the case of a physical phenomenon, to its atomic and subatomic particles. It is realized to be nothing in and of itself, merely a collection or aggregate of smaller, seemingly indivisible particles. So that there is at least a partial step in realizing the egolessness of that phenomenon, realizing the ultimate non-reality of that phenomenon. But again, it is only a partial realization, because while these phenomena are reduced to their basic units of composition, those basic units remain something which are perceived as real, something actually solid or ultimately real.
주자표로다 라스파 소로 외래에서 통화 단체 되네 산 코로 처음에 통화까지 받으면다 땡파는 기타지 정말다고 망하다고 쳤다고 인자선다고 그지 동시다고 나서 이제는 때 이제 중이 뭐네 그 기타지도 많이 땡파네 아들은 공로 다음에 치지 다음에 니까 다시 말하고 또 해야래.
In case of the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva path, it is assumed from the word go that all phenomena that are experienced are merely projections of or manifestations of mind, that they have no ultimate reality in and of themselves, but are directly comparable to the experiences in a dream. And with that understanding, the meditation that is developed, the view that is developed in the Mahayana, involves the comparison of our states of existence to what are known as the 8 or 12 traditional similes and metaphors of illusory existence. When we speak of all phenomena as being comparable to a reflection in a mirror, or the moon reflected in the surface of water, or a rainbow, or a mirage, or a castle in the sky, all of these traditional examples which are used are to illustrate the fact that the phenomena that the mind experiences have no more reality than that which the mind ascribes to them. They are projections of manifestations of the mind and nothing more. With that kind of approach, the meditation can be carried, this view can be carried through meditation to its fullest extent, where the individual on the Mahayana path can realize not only the egolessness of the individual self, but the complete egolessness of all phenomena, and therefore there is a totality, a 100% experience of enlightenment.
내가 지금 집을 파고 채시라고 했어요. 다르잖아. 근데 치판치도 마마다고 때 파다 집하라고 그랬지. 내나요. 근데 또만 탑도 보고 또 먹고 또만 또만 많이 또 말을 이제 많이 넣어서 살아도 파르지 탑도 된다 그랬지. 그 탑도 되네. 또도 지켜봐. 산 해지 봐 치고 산 해지 봐 치고래. 사실 애매하고만에 그것도만 다 파송을 했는데요. 산 해지 봐 치고 산 해지 봐 치고래.
The same basic approach is valid in Vajrayana practice, the understanding of the illusory or dreamlike nature of all phenomena, all phenomenal experience, as being merely a projection or manifestation of mind. However, the Vajrayana makes far more use, we might say, of that particular statement and what is implied by it. We can see already in the Prajnaparamita literature, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, known as the Heart Sutra, where it says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Other than form there is no emptiness, other than emptiness there is no form. We can find the basic statement that Mahayana and Vajrayana agree upon. But the Vajrayana goes one step further with that. And using that as an understanding, using that as a basis, that all phenomena are a projection of the mind, the approach is to experience the simultaneity, the union of mind and phenomena. This is referred to as the mind itself, as the primordial co-emergent state of awareness, which is Dharmakaya. And any appearance, any phenomenon, any thing that arises in the mind, any state of experience, as merely the radiance of the Dharmakaya. Now, we've been examining differences between the Hinayana and its two divisions of the Shravaka path and the Pratyeka Buddha path, the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva path, and the Vajrayana, the Tantric path. There do exist these differences. They are, on a very practical level, different paths in a sense. This is not to say that one should assume, therefore, that one is good and the other is bad, that there is a pejorative statement implied in saying that there is a difference. It is not the case that one is better than, or one is more noble than and more worth keeping than the other. It is not the case that one is good and the other is bad and should be eliminated or avoided. It is simply that different people need different kinds of teachings for their different situations, for their different inclinations, for their different capabilities. While the purpose of giving medicine is to eliminate disease, you do not give the same medicine for each and every disease. Each specific disease requires its specific medicine. In the same way, each specific person's spiritual needs require them to take a certain kind of medicine. A person whose spiritual needs in their situation require the Hinayana teachings should, in fact, rely upon, should ingest the Hinayana teachings in order to cure themselves of their sickness. A person whose illness, whose spiritual ills, require the Mahayana teachings should ingest the Mahayana teachings. A person who requires the Tantric teachings should ingest those teachings. The point is that this spectrum of teachings is necessary in order to answer to the needs of this wide variety of individuals. As regards the Tantric tradition, particularly those teachings which were brought to Tibet, they are classified into two systems which are known as the Sarma and the Nyingma systems, that is to say the later or newer schools of Tantric practice and the earlier or ancient schools. There is a slight difference here on the classification of the teachings. The essential meaning of the teachings is not different, but the particular way on a practical level that these teachings will be presented depends upon whether one is following a Sarma school, a new school, or the Nyingma school. It's worth noting that on the level of the Hinayana and Mahayana teachings that these schools present, there is no difference. The same presentation of the Shravaka path, the Pacceka Buddha path, these two levels of the Hinayana, of the Bodhisattva path, of the Mahayana, these are identical in all cases. What does differ is the way in which the Tantric teachings are classified and presented. In the case of the Sarma schools, the new schools, the classification follows what are known as the four classes of Tantra, the four levels of Tantra, which are technically termed Kriya, Charya, Yoga, and Anuttara Yoga Tantras. In the Nyingmapa school, the Nyingmapa system, there is reference to what are called the 6 Tantra classes, because the outer Tantras, or lower level Tantras, which correspond to the first 3 of the Sarma Tantras, are called Kriya, Upa, and Yoga, instead of Kriya, Charya, and Yoga. The second one is termed Upa Tantra instead of Charya Tantra. And then the 3 higher levels of Tantra are termed Mahayoga, Anuyoga, and Ati Yoga. And so in the Nyingmapa school we find the reference to the 9 yanas, the 9 vehicles and 9 yanas of Buddha Dharma. The first 3 being the Shravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and Bodhisattva yanas. The next 3, the intermediate 3, being the Kriya Tantra, Upa Tantra, and Yoga Tantra. And the final 3, the highest 3 levels, being termed the Mahayoga, Anuyoga, and Ati Yoga Tantras.
Sani Tibainde, Kadarasana, Sanega Saudi, Shepard, Lanji, Suntato, Nimaka Playa, Payava Center, and Tabit of Matu Tibari.
The similarity that can be seen is that while there are slightly different technical terms used to describe these first three levels of Tantra, for example, in the case of the Sarma school, them being termed Kriya, Charya, and Yoga, and in the Nyingma school, them being termed Kriya, Upa, and Yoga. Nevertheless, the level of experience to which they relate is identical in both cases. There is no difference on any essential level of the experience that is generated by these practices. In the case of the Sarma schools, then, the Anuttara Yoga Tantras represent the fourth and highest class of Tantra. They are very often divided into three subdivisions. What are termed the Father Tantras, which emphasize skillful means, and particularly the practice known as Kiran in Tibetan, or Utpatikrama in Sanskrit, the stage of development, what is sometimes termed the arising yoga, or the stage of development, the stage of creation. And the second level, which is termed Mother Tantra, which emphasizes the wisdom aspect and the development of Dzogchen or Sampanakrama, the stage of fulfillment, and the non-dual or union tantras, literally non-dual tantras, which represent the combination of integration of these two stages of practice and the principles of skillful means and wisdom being emphasized equally in integration. And so we have the father, mother, and non-dual tantras of this, as subdivisions of this fourth class of Anuttara Yoga. These classes of father, mother, and non-dual tantra correspond exactly to Mahayoga, Anu Yoga, and Atma Yoga in the Nyingma system. On a practical basis, the term Nyingma as opposed to Sarma is used simply to distinguish a certain way in which these teachings developed, way in which they were particularly introduced to Tibet. In the case of the Nyingma school, this refers to the teachings that were brought to Tibet during the earliest wave of Buddhist transmission from India. This occurred during the reign of the king Trisang Detsen and took place under the spiritual auspices of many teachers, principally the Tantra Guru Padmasambhava and the Indian abbot Shantirakshita. And under the auspices of this king and these two religious figures from India, the Pandit and abbot on the one case, on the one hand, and the Tantra Guru on the other, the transmission of Buddha Dharma began through the interaction of Indian pundits and scholars with Tibetan translators. And there are certain kinds of teachings which are particular to this Nyingma system. There's one presentation of Dzogchen teachings, of Mahāti teachings, which are known as the three classes, or the three categories. The first of these being called Semde in Tibetan, which means the category of mind. The second being called Longde, rather difficult to translate, but something like the category of space, of a certain realm of experience or a certain space. And the third, which is termed Mengot De in Tibetan, which means the category of specific instructions, or pith instructions. And these and many other teachings were translated and introduced to the Tibetan people at this point. And a tradition developed, a tradition was established, which was transmitted over generations, in which countless numbers of people became involved, and through which countless numbers of people attained to states of liberation and enlightenment. And this earlier system of Buddhism, which began at the time of this king and these Indian teachers in Tibet, is known as the Nyingma system, the old or early school. During the development of this school, during its early development, there was more or less no attention paid to, or no importance accredited to the person's individual lifestyle. Whether the person was a lay person, whether the person was a monk, an ordained person, didn't matter. The point was that one developed, based upon a certain view, a certain worldview or philosophical view, one developed meditation through receiving direct instructions from one's guru, using these, meditating intensively with these instructions, and ideally attaining enlightenment, attaining to a state of realization, attaining what is the state which is known as the rainbow body, whatever, carrying it through to its completion. Now, the difficulty that arose was that while many people were very fortunate to clearly understand the view that was being presented, clearly understand the instructions they were receiving, and were able therefore to attain these states of enlightenment, such as the rainbow body or the state of a siddha, on the other hand, many people became confused. Many people, through their initial misunderstanding of the view that was being presented, and through their confusion with having no guidelines of what constituted proper conduct, proper lifestyle, the way in which one conducted oneself in the world, they began to make very fatal errors and confuse what was correct practice with what was just ordinary, meaningless activity, worldly activity. At a certain point, then, the situation in Tibet had developed to the point where it was very difficult to distinguish between someone who was a pure practitioner of Dharma and someone who was either a charlatan or misguided, simply did not understand what they were doing.
Sur la situation.
La force, le pouvoir.
Deuxième, c'est agrandissement.
One végétal,
Quoi?
pouvoir.
Un des pouvoirs.
Pouvoir, la force.
Tu vois pas Wong. Dans tout ça, on voit les forces qui sont plutôt mentales, qui donnent une forme individuelle, une forme vivante. On parle des êtres, des esprits vides, etc. Et de la même façon, on parle des démons. Mais tout ça, en fait, parle de la même chose qu'on parle. Que nous parlons de les voir, de les
At a certain point, he was in a region which is now part of what we would call Kashmir. In Tibet, the king
on devient possédé, comme tu peux dire.
Possédé, on est possédé.
On devient possesseur.
On vient de la carrière.
On devient possédé. Ouais.
Non, possesseur.
Ça dépend si c'est la phrase.
Ah ouais.
En possession.
Parce que possédé, c'est pas...
En fait, tu dis
Possédé, c'est possédé par les démons. Maquillé.
de
On a qui est
Maquillé.
l'influence de l'évêque.
what he saw happening around him at this degeneration.
Ouais, ça arrive.
Bon.
At a certain point, there appeared in Tibet a king whose name was Salama Shangshabut. And this king was very concerned at what he saw happening around him, at this degeneration of, or cheapening of the teachings, where things were becoming so confused. And he became very inspired by the idea of sending intelligent young Tibetans to India to be trained as translators, and of inviting scholars and meditators from the Indian Buddhist tradition to come to Tibet in order to teach, in order to revivify the teachings and introduce the pure practice of Buddha Dharma once again. At that point, the project was a considerable one because it was quite a long way, along an arduous journey to India, and the king decided to finance this project by collecting as much gold as he could from whoever would sponsor such a project, and using this gold which was collected as the means to pay for the expenses of sending these Tibetans to India and of inviting these Indians to Tibet. At a certain point, he was in a region which is now part of what we would call Kashmir, and while collecting or soliciting sponsorship for this project, he was arrested and held him ransom. And as much as the king's subjects, this Tibetan king's subjects, tried to persuade this king of the area of Kashmir to let their own king go, he refused. And he said, I will not let your king go until you can present me with an amount of gold which is equal to his body weight. Now, Now, at that point in that area of Tibet, that was quite a tall order because the kingdom was not a rich one at all, but by scraping together whatever they could find, his subjects managed to come up with an amount of gold which was equal to Shangri-La's body weight. And they sent a letter to their king in prison and said, we now have enough money to ransom you, enough gold rather to ransom you. And the king replied, don't bother, don't waste your time. It's not important that I am ransomed or not. If I must spend the rest of my life in this jail, that's all right with me if this project which I had envisaged can take place. And use that gold which has been accumulated in order to carry out this project of sending Tibetans to India to be trained properly, of inviting scholars from India. And so this became part of the movement at that point in Tibet to bring this new transmission of the teachings from India. And many scholars and meditators from the Indian tradition were invited. Many Tibetans went to India to be trained and taught to function as translators and teachers in their own right. And foremost among the Indian teachers who was invited was the great Atisha. And from that time that Atisha and his contemporaries reestablished the teachings in Tibet, a certain model of spiritual practice, which is based upon the concept of the three vows, the three levels of ordination, came into being. That is the ideal spiritual practitioner, the ideal practitioner of Buddha Dharma, being someone who, on an outer level, behaves in accordance with what are known as the Patimoksha vows, the vows of the lay community and the monastic community. Whereas on an inner level, is motivated in accordance with the Bodhisattva vow of the Mahayana, while on a secret level, was developing their inner experience in accordance with the Samaya, or commitment of tantric practice. And from that time, then, this serves as a model for spiritual practice, these three levels of ordination and involvement that the model practitioner should have. One of the things that the teacher emphasized most in his teaching was the concept of taking refuge as the fundamental basis for Buddhist practice, for the practice of Buddha Dharma. In fact, he became so well known for his insistence upon refuge and the concept of taking refuge as a basis that he was known as the Refuge Pundit. People who didn't know his own personal name still knew him as the Refuge Pundit because he became so famous, so well known for his insistence upon and his emphasis upon this basic concept of Buddhist practice. His main students were three individuals whose names were Ku, Ngok, and Gum. They carried on the lineage then that Atisha established in Tibet. One of their main disciples was a Geshe whose name was Geshe Drepa, and it was Geshe Drepa who was one of the personal teachers of Gampopa, of the Kargi lineage. And so, in the case of the Kargi school, we can trace our origins back to these lineages of Atisha through Geshe Drepa, who was one of the root gurus of Gampopa. Up to this point of Gampopa, the mainstream Kagyu transmission, as we are most familiar with, beginning with Tilopa and Naropa in India and continued by Marpa and Milarepa in Tibet, was again a tradition that did not place particular emphasis upon the lifestyle or conduct of the person, whether that person was ordained, whether that person was lay, whatever. The important thing was that one received pith instructions in a very intimate, very direct way from one's teacher and use them with great diligence, with great energy and concentration and application to the practice in order to realize the results. Now, at the point that Gampopa enters the lineage, he brought with him his training and his experience from the Kadampa system, which was the name of the system that started with the teachings of Atisha. When he met Milarepa and accepted Milarepa as his guru and was accepted as a disciple by Milarepa, he continued his training under Milarepa based upon the experience and training that he had already done in the Kadampa system. And his realization became as vast as space. He attained to enlightenment under the tutelage of Milarepa. However, he introduced into the mainstream Kagyu transmission this element of the Kadampa training that he had had, which emphasized not only the inner experience, but also the outer comportment of the individual. In the case of Gampopa, he was a fully ordained monk, a bhikshu, and the inner level of the motivation of the Bodhisattva yana, and so forth. And so, at this point, the situation occurred, which is referred to as the converging of two rivers, that of the Kadampa and that of the what we normally refer to as the Karjupa school. And in fact, it was Gampopa who effected this blending or converging of these two rivers. Following Gampopa, in the next several generations of the lineage holders of the Kagyu lineage, what are referred to as the 4 major and 8 minor schools of the Kagyu system developed. In particular, of course, one of the main disciples of Gampopa himself was Duzum Khenpa, the first Gawakamapa. Since that time, there has been a strong emphasis in the Kagyu school upon this concept of the 3 levels of ordination, the 3 levels of commitment to practice. And in fact, what has occurred is that most of the lineage holders of these schools have been monastically ordained, have been holders of monastic ordination, rather. In the case of the Kagyu school, at its peak, it was numbered. The number of major monasteries were numbered at 108, and the number of minor monasteries throughout Tibet at 1,002. So the school, following the time of Gampopa, enjoyed very widespread popularity, spreading very widely throughout the area of Central Asia. Now, at the same time that Gampopa was introducing this element of Kadampa training into the structure of the Kagyu transmission, at the same time the disciples of Atisha, from Geshe Drepa onwards, continued to carry on the mainstream of what was known as the Great Kadampa line, which remained in existence as a distinct lineage until the time of the 4th Gawakamapa, Ropé Dorje. At that time there appeared the great Tsongkhapa, who, using these Kadampa teachings as a basis, taking the transmission of the lineage upon himself, presented it in such a way that it became a distinct transmission in its own right due to his vast activity. And from that point on, it was known as the New Kadampa, to distinguish it from the tradition which existed from the time of Atisha up until the great Tsongkhapa's time. And what is sometimes referred to as the New Kadampa school, or the Gadempa school, is what we now know today as the Gelugpa school. During the period of this later transmission of teachings around the time of Atisha, there were a number of Tibetans who also functioned as translators of these teachings and scholars, teachers who presented these teachings in their own right. Of the Kadampa line, the most famous was a translator whose name was Rinchen Zongpo. In the Kagyu school, of course, it was Marpa the translator who functioned in this way to bring teachings from India, translate them from their original languages into Tibetan, and present them as a codified, integrated system to Tibetans. Due to the activity of these different translators, they developed what are known as the 8 major schools of practice and the 10 major transmissions of scholarly exegesis of Buddhism in Tibet. The distinction then between the Sarma and the Nyingma schools, that is to say the new or later schools and the older, earlier schools, is simply based upon this time scale, that certain teachings, which are still in existence today as a living transmission, began at the time of the Guru Padmasambhava and the abbot Shantirakshita during the reign of the Tibetan king Trisen Detsen. Those teachings which are dated from that time, from that introduction of Buddhism to Tibet at that early stage, are known as the Nyingma teachings, the old or the early teachings. Those which rather entered Tibet for the first time during the period of Marpa the translator, of the Kadampa translator, Rinchen Zongpo, and so forth, at the time of the Indian Pandita Atisha, from that time onwards, we speak of the Sarma, or newer, later schools. Now, on a practical level, the only distinct school now of Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, which refers to this earlier period, is what we know as the Nyingma school. This name has come to refer not only to a point of origin, but the actual school that we now know as the Nyingmapa system. The Sakyapa, Gelupa, Kagyupa schools are what we would term Sarma, because they date most specifically from the time of Atisha, of Marpa, of Rinchen Zongpo, and so forth, this later wave of transmission. It is for this reason that we find slight differences in the way these schools present their teachings. In the case of the Nyingma system, there is the system of the 9 yanas, which we referred to previously, in which there are these 6 levels of Tantra. In the case of the Sarma schools, Sakyapa, Gelupa, Kagyupa, there are the 3 vehicles of the Shravakayana, Pracheka Buddhayana, and the Bodhisattva yana, but the Tantra teachings are presented as a series of 4 classes, usually. The normal discussion deals with the 4 classes of Kriya, Charya, Yoga, and Anuttara Yoga. The particular origins of these 4 classes of Tantra are explained as follows. First one must take into consideration the Buddhist concept of the creation of this universe in which we live. That before any beings inhabited this universe, there was a long period of physical formation where, due to the collective karma of the beings that would take rebirth in this realm, the various physical elements began to form and to take shape until such a point as there was a physical basis for life to exist, following which gradually the process of populating this universe, as it were, took place, of beings through their own individual karma coming into existence in this collective environment. In the case of human beings, the first humans, from the Buddhist point of view, were in fact gods of the form realm. The gods of the form realm are referred to as enjoying one of the four states of dhyana, or a kind of worldly absorption, a worldly state of meditation. There are 17 classes of these form gods, some of whom at that time were held to experience a certain decrease in their merit, which meant that they did not remain solely in that God's realm, but actually began to make contact with the physical plane of the human realm, or what would become the human realm. At that point, it was a very brief contact. These beings were not forced by their circumstances to remain there, to take nourishment there, or whatever. They still enjoyed very much the status of a god in the cycle of rebirth, but there was this element of coarsening or degeneration in their merit, which brought them to this lower, more solid physical level of existence for regular, brief periods of time. The process which brought these beings down to a more and more physical level of existence is divided into certain stages, which is understood from the point of view of the sexual relationships, the actual activity or relationship between the sexes. Now, because even at this time, although these were low-level gods, we might say, they were still sentient beings, still unenlightened beings, which means that their minds were subject to emotional conflict, emotional activity, one of the most fundamental of which is sexual attraction between male and female. Now, at that point, at the first stage, which corresponds to the presentation of Kriya Tantra, the first level of Tantra, the act which was required to satiate the desire or attraction between a man and a woman was mere eye contact. The emotions were subtle at that point. They were more or less latent, we might say. They were not as obvious or as overwhelming as human beings later came to experience. But at that point, mere eye contact was sufficient to satiate temporarily that desire or attraction which was felt between the sexes. That corresponds to the level of Kriya Tantra, the teachings presented which are in harmony with or in accordance with that particular level of emotional experience. This process continued with the emotions becoming more complicated and the means to satisfy those emotions becoming more complex as well. The second stage is that where mere eye contact was not sufficient, but some kind of flirtation, some kind of exchange, verbal exchange, became necessary in order to play out the emotion of desire or attraction between the sexes. This level of emotional complexity corresponds to the presentation of the Charya Tantra teachings, the second of the four levels. The third stage required not only eye contact, not only some kind of exchange, but the pleasure of physical contact, of touching hands, or in some way enjoying the pleasure of physical contact in order to satiate or play out the emotion of desire or attraction. This corresponds to the level of Yoga Tantra. And the situation finally arose where sexual union, sexual intercourse, became regarded, as it is now, as the means by which sexual desire is played out, is satiated, is consummated. This corresponds to the presentation of the Anuttara Yoga Tantra teachings, the highest level of these 4 classes of Tantra. And so the presentation of the 4 classes of Tantra, Kriya Tantra, Charya Tantra, Yoga Tantra, and Anuttara Yoga Tantra, is seen as related to this progression of human beings as beings in the desire realm. We inhabit a particular realm of experience in the universe known as the desire realm, where desire plays perhaps the strongest part in our emotional makeup, and this solidification process, this complication process of the experience between the sexes, from the period of eye contact to that of exchange, to that of physical contact, to that of sexual union, is seen as a spectrum or a progression which is directly related to the presentation of the 4 classes of Tantra. Based upon these kind of instructions, then, different models for spiritual practice developed. The concept of very rapid attainment of enlightenment, ideally within a single lifetime, failing that within the, or during the bardo state, or the after-death state between death and rebirth, failing that within 3 lifetimes, or within 7 lifetimes, or within 16 lifetimes, on a cosmic scale, a very rapid attainment of enlightenment through the various levels of the Tantric teachings. In our particular world, then, we have seen the development of 2 kinds of Dharma. There is the spiritual or divine Dharma, the teachings which are geared towards this idea of a state of enlightenment, regardless of how quickly or how slowly this goal is perceived of as being attainable. The other kinds of teachings or Dharma which exist in our world are purely mundane. These are certain kinds of scientific inquiry, of technology, of material progress, things which are concerned only with this life. They benefit us very much on the level of nutrition, of clothing ourselves, of living our lives on this material plane between birth and death, but they do not really apply beyond that for the individual. Therefore, the distinction we can make between these 2 vast areas of human experience and human learning are that one pertains only to this life and the other pertains to something beyond the experiences that the individual will have in this life. The fact that we have this human existence in this particular situation is not something that came about by chance. It did not happen at random. It did not just pop out of nowhere. There are reasons to account for the fact that our mind is experiencing this particular kind of rebirth in a human state at this particular time. This is, on a general level, best explained by the karmic nature, the karmic makeup of the individual. That at some point in previous existences, positive virtuous actions were committed, resulting in positive virtuous karmic tendencies, which predominated to the point in that individual's makeup that that individual now finds himself or herself, here in this human realm, in this human body. This is a superior state, a fortunate state of existence, which could only come about through that kind of positive or virtuous karma in operation.
then go show a pen in the Pamapa, see the Manchepa, did the show Constaza concested the king in Miliaris, the second to me so much the Milisara before it. Australiaris, but before in the Chekarisana, then here at the Tempina, then I sent some up the North America live short service, tested the Sarah, people should not this.
Now, it is not simply that being human per se is so extraordinary. It is true that the human realm of experience is one of the higher, more fortunate realms of experience within the cycle of rebirth, but it depends upon how that human rebirth is being used. Based upon that kind of consideration, we can distinguish certain people who have a very inferior kind of human existence. They have no interest in spiritual development at all, of developing the human potential. They have no interest in behaving in a decent way. Some people seem to spend their lives in a very negative way. They accumulate a lot of negative karma. They seem to involve themselves as much as they can, almost as though they were trying to be as evil as possible. They are in fact turning away from this whole concept of virtue, of spiritual development and so forth, almost as though on purpose, and spend their lives in a very negative way, causing a great deal of harm to themselves and others. Now, one cannot call that a precious human state of existence. That is in fact a complete waste of the human state of existence. It is the lowest kind of human being possible, a person who behaves in that completely evil way because they are wasting the opportunity that is presented to them by the general circumstances of a human rebirth. In the case of such an individual, the only future that they can expect is the rebirth of that consciousness in a lower state of increased suffering and confusion. Now, there are many people, the vast majority of people, who spend their lives in a very mediocre way. They're not particularly evil people at all. They're perfectly good people. They pass their lives in a perfectly decent way. But again, there is no spiritual element. They're not thinking of anything beyond this life, and all that they accomplish takes place within this life, and there's nothing to show for it after. There's no particular benefit, there's no particular harm. They're not bad people, they're not particularly good people either, in any spiritual sense of the word. They don't accomplish anything beyond the context of this life. They pass their lives in a very mediocre way, and the result is to be expected, very mediocre. They do not fall into some horrible lower realm of experience. They do not attain to some vastly superior state of existence. Their next state of rebirth will be a very mediocre one without any particular distinguishing characteristic, because that is the way they pass their lives. What we mean by a precious human state of existence, the truly excellent kind of human existence, is a person who is not only a good person in their own right, but is sincerely involved in some spiritual quest. This person who has come into contact with teachings and teachers, has respect and faith in these, and is actually trying to apply them and develop them. This person is not only passing this life in a very positive way, but establishing conditions that will bring about a very fortunate, very superior kind of rebirth in the future. And on a more ultimate scale, that person is working towards the attainment of complete enlightenment. Is gradually attaining to this state of enlightenment. Now that is the best possible use that can be made of the human rebirth. That is what we would term the precious human existence. This is what all of you seem to be in possession of now, seem to be enjoying. This status of the precious human state of existence with all of the opportunities and all of the freedom that it affords one for spiritual development.
왜냐하면 치료텔레스는 진짜 하트도 지금 말이 치료텔레스 가르쳐는 편한 직전에 되네 서서 공성받다 좀 됐잖아요. 떠난 알아서 뭐 비누네 사사 약해지고 콤바 야채 땡사까지 때문에 저렇게 표현서가 다시 하려면 말지도 말하지 무슨나 이 사실은 다 처음부터 가봐야 말을 내서는 그는 지금 때다 간다 타야나요. 저는 한 처음에 저는 도와지 말고 스스로 요구 되네 그 요하나를 그래서 그렇게 해서도 반드시
This is not to say that the practice of Dharma, that spiritual teaching is all that is important, and that anything else is complete waste of time. There are obvious needs that an individual has in this life. To begin with, the basic necessities of food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. There are certain things a person needs in this life which are absolutely necessary, and a certain amount of attention and activity in one's life is obviously required to assure one of those basic necessities. The only thing that is important is to keep things in perspective, because one can in no way consider anything to do with this life as anything permanent, and that is important to keep in mind in order to have the proper perspective. Regardless of how much effort one puts forth in this life to enjoy oneself, to become rich, to become famous, to become successful, to become fulfilled in any way which has only to do with this life and this personality, this particular stage of one's experience, then it is going to be very limited in its effect. One may certainly attain, possibly, those goals to which one is working. But on a more long-term scale, all that one is doing at this point is experiencing the same things that we experience when we have a good dream. We lie down and go to sleep at night, we experience a dream, perhaps we dream of coming to a wonderful place, a beautiful home, we walk in and everything is provided for us, everything is wonderful, we're happy, we couldn't imagine a state of happiness better than this. And at some point we wake up, and that was all a dream, and it all passed away. It was all in the past. We are no longer experiencing that state of happiness. In the same way, regardless of how happy, how successful, how fulfilled we become in this life, at a certain point we all must die. And with death comes the waking up from that dream, in the sense that all of that experience that we have now simply becomes meaningless at that point. It is left and the mind goes into some other state of experience. So it is necessary to keep things in their proper perspective. The only thing that will be of value to one at that point, that inevitable point of one's death, is the practice of Dharma that one has done. It's the experience and realization that one has developed through one's practice. Nothing else really is going to matter. And that is something that is necessary to keep in perspective so that one does not overemphasize the one to the expense of the other. Just as Shantideva said in his Bodhacharyavatara, once one has come to this very fortunate state of human existence with its opportunities and its freedom, if one does not make use of that opportunity, but instead waste it, how can one ever hope to have such a precious opportunity again? The point is that this opportunity is not only a very special one, it is a very rare one. Those of you who are associated with this particular center here have a very fortunate opportunity to make use of those opportunities and that freedom. Under the guidance of the Venerable Akong Rinpoche, the center here has been developing in many ways, from the point of view of the teaching activities, from the point of view of the construction of sites for the future form, speech, and mind symbols of enlightenment to take shape. Many people are looking forward to practicing in a long-term retreat here and so forth. And so in many ways, people are able to involve themselves in their understanding, in the understanding and the experience of the teachings of Buddha Dharma. This represents a very fortunate opportunity which one should remain very conscious of, that there is this precious, very special opportunity. benefit of all beings.
李总呢，
第一，当时是把你泡呢，你被张南pom些呢，这个拿起巴拉出，是被做了做完做完。且我跟三南一些做做的，三南一些来成为三八跟你做法术。Rinpoche, che pa nan chi shirji, che pa nyam pa me pa dong, kone kong tu pe wa shu. Sha pe pen pa na, kanya yong la de chi chung. Ka che ma lu, so sa che chan ne, nyur de san de sa la ge pa